Good morning, everybody. At the outset, David invited us to offer an optimistic outlook this morning, and I have to disappoint you because I don't do optimism. What I do is realism, which is sometimes confused with pessimism in this country. And the only thing I have to say, unfortunately, is that what's described as my pessimism often turns out to be what actually happens. So there you are. In any event, we were invited here to talk about alternatives to austerity, and I could deliver my speech in 2 sentences, actually. The best alternative to austerity, one-sided austerity, as it's practiced in Ireland and in Europe over the past number of years, is to stop it. This very minute. That's the best alternative. Because we can look at the results of the experiment over the past few years in Europe. The Eurozone economy has contracted for 6 quarters in a row. Domestic demand now stands 5% below the 2007 level. The economies of the stressed countries of southern Europe have collapsed, and they're still going through the floorboards. That's what's happened. That's the result of the experiment. And it's not because the global economy is in a mess, because thanks to the policies of Obama and Bernanke, I never thought I'd see myself saying that, in the United States, their economy has actually grown by about 5%. And they've created 7 million jobs, not net jobs, but 7 million jobs have been created. And over the same period, the global economy has grown by 20%. That's the comparator of that's the result of the experiment. Now, where's it all going? Well, where it's all going, let's be frank about it, unless there is a change of course, unless we get some kind of write-off of, or at least mutualisation of debt, combined with a major fiscal initiative at European level that enables countries to generate jobs and to grow their economies so that they can reduce their debt-GDP ratio, where it's going is to the collapse of the euro and maybe the demise of the democratic system in a number of countries. People say it can't happen. The forces out there that will make it happen are mustering as we speak. Because okay, it may not happen today or tomorrow, and it probably will happen, most likely, after a prolonged period of stagnation and anemic levels of growth, which will be from time to time interspaced with recurring false dawns, which will always be heralded as the end of the recession. Well, I think we may well be entering one of these false dawns at the minute. Now, we should stop talking about it in terms of austerity, as though it was some kind of a neutral word that everybody experienced. It's actually a violence that's perpetrated against working people and those who depend most on public services in the way that it has been administered in Europe and in Ireland over the past number of years. And in Europe, there isn't much to do in this place, but in Europe it's accompanied, it's a deadly concoction, actually, of fiscal retrenchment accompanied by what they call labour market reform. Now, that's a nice word for describing the most sustained attack on the gains made by organised workers since the Second World War. That's what's going on. Because what we're actually living through is a kind of a brutal recalibration which is attempting to engineer a retrospective, pre-Euro realignment of economies and, of course, societies with a currency instead of the other way around, because the currency doesn't suit the economies. And what's happening is in the process, they're dismantling the post-war settlement, particularly in the area of employer-worker relationships, dramatically shifting wealth from labour to capital, and asserting the tooth and claw rule of the free market in the workplace. And simultaneously, the post-war settlement is being dismantled by relentless austerity in the social field, the wider social arena as well. I've heard this described as the Germanification of Europe. It's a totally inappropriate term. It's the Americanization of Europe that's going on. Or you could even describe it as the Ryanairisation of Europe that's going on. And parallel with all of this, and tragically, for all of us, even though we don't know it, social democracy is committing political suicide because its attempt to ameliorate the impact of what's happening is being mistaken and misunderstood and sometimes deliberately misrepresented as collaboration with what's going on. And social democracy here is experiencing that process of committing political suicide as well. And what this means, this is the bad bit for the people who don't like social democrats. What it means is that when the reaction materialises, as it inevitably will, all the lessons of history, it inevitably will, it won't be people like me that will be leading it. It'll be the people on the populist, xenophobic right, with enormous implications for civil society in Europe. And the great tragedy of all of this is that the strong economies of Central and Northern Europe have the capacity to underpin a kind of new social contract, which could be underwritten by the ECB, a kind of post-collapse settlement to replace the post-war settlement. And this would facilitate an actual sustainable realignment over a reasonable time frame. And most crucially, it would entail a different balance between stimulus now and fiscal effort over the medium term. And the German DGB has put forward very exciting proposals for a kind of European Marshall Plan to underpin this. Now, the great irony is that the ECB's capacity to do this, to underpin this, is attributable to the success of the great economies of Central and Northern Europe. And do you know what featured largely in their success? The post-war settlement that's being dismantled as we speak. The new Pope, Pope Francis, he hit the nail on the head, actually, before embarking on his recent trip to Brazil, when he said, and I quote, "If investments in banks drop a little, it's a tragedy. But if people are starving, if they have nothing to eat, if they are not healthy, it doesn't matter. This," he said, "this is our crisis today." And how right he was, ladies and gentlemen, how right he was. That's Europe dealt with now. Look at Ireland. Another 10 minutes. Now, the question is, what if anything can we do here? We do have very little room to manoeuvre. I don't broadly disagree with the canopy painted by John and Fiona in their contributions. We are hamstrung with unsustainable debt, which we shouldn't be, but we are, and probably more or less the highest deficit in the EU as well. We really do not have any option but to stick to the 3% deficit target by 2015, even though it's a nonsensical target now. But we have to stick with it. We've had this horrendous adjustment where we've taken €28 billion, nearly 18% of GDP out of our economy. We've taken €28 billion out of our economy to reduce the deficit by how much? Do you know how much? The underlying deficit, by taking out €28 billion, has been reduced by just about €6 billion. And we're calling that a success. And of course, as a result of those policies, our economy now has come through 3 successive falls in GDP, quarter by quarter by quarter. So then the question is given the limited scope for manoeuvrability, what can we actually do? Well, we should apply the first law of digging holes. We should stop digging. We should stop doing things that are making it worse. Domestic demand collapsed by 3% in the first quarter, directly attributable to the budget of last year. Directly attributable. And the key, quite seriously now, all joking aside, the key in terms of alternatives to austerity is finding a better balance, actually, between fiscal effort on the one hand and a combination of measures to improve growth on the other. We have to try and create a platform to encourage the private sector to spend more, to consume more, to invest more, unlocking the savings ratio, and I know part of it is due to deleveraging, probably excessive deleveraging, in order to ignite this domestic economy, which is the key to the future, the real economy in any country. And I fully accept that this will not be achieved overnight, but I would advance the proposition that by applying the right combination of policies, we can change the trajectory of the direction of our economy. We can turn the ship around so that it is headed in a positive direction rather than a negative one. And the space afforded by the promissory note deal, for which John and others are to be congratulated, insofar as it went, but the actual deal affords us a chance to begin the work of turning the ship around. That's the important thing about it. And just as the glimmer of light appears in the tunnel, what happens? All the people who reflect the interests of the 1% or the 5%, the people at the top of the European banking system, if you want to throw in the ESRI, we'll say the top 10%. All of them are queuing up, as if on cue, to tell the government, don't do it. It'll be the end of civilization if you don't do a 3.1 billion budget. And what these comfortable voices of the top 10, 5% or whatever they are actually doing is blackmailing the government to screw poor people. That's what's going on. That's the real debate. And it is nothing short of blackmail. We've been threatened with the loss of a retrospective recapitalisation of our banks by the ESM, which the head of the Eurogroup incidentally is on the record as saying won't happen anyway, but they're threatening us with it nonetheless. We've been threatened with the loss of the precautionary credit line. And the fact of the matter is these threats can't be ignored. These are serious people with a serious agenda. And we do need assistance with that bank debt. Because if we don't get it, we will be forced at best to face into a future which is a low inflation, low growth future, trying to carry that burden on our backs and on the backs of the next generation, if it doesn't bury us altogether. So this is high stakes stuff for the government, and anybody who says they should just tell them to bugger off and all that isn't really capturing the real extent of the challenge facing the government. Our government will have to display nerves of steel in facing down this blackmail. Because, ladies and gentlemen, and it's very fundamental, and it's about values, and it's about us as a people, and it's about 1916. It's one thing having to inflict misery on people who have little or nothing, because it's the least worst of the available options. But going along with it when it's unnecessary is actually not only economically unsustainable, but it's worse than that. It's morally indefensible. That's the reality of it. And over the next 3 months, our government, and people like John and others, will be called upon to display the same degree of guts and courage that they displayed in applying budgets 2012 and budgets 2013, and with their implications for poor people. They have to display that courage now to face up to the tyrants that reflect the interests of the big banks in Europe. And that will be a hard decision. Taking money from poor people is not a hard decision. These fellows bite back, and you have to be prepared to face them down. And the government doesn't have a great deal of leverage, but it does have some. Because if our programme goes off the rails, the whole project, the whole pack of cards, the whole illusion that it's working collapses. So we do have some leverage. Now, with the promissory note deal, we can achieve the 5.1% target, which we're required to achieve. They've changed the goalposts, but that's what's in the agreement. We can achieve that with a 2.1 billion adjustment, with a little room to spare, because depending on what comes out today on the Exchequer figures, we're probably still a little bit ahead anyway. And then you look at that 2.1 billion budget, and actually the measures that are carried forward from the last budget, plus the Haddington Road deal, they really account for the guts of another billion. So now you're really looking at a 1.1 billion budget. And in this regard, the first consideration is how rapidly to apply the €6 billion, which has been redesignated from the Pension Reserve Fund to the Strategic Investment Fund. One of the very good decisions the government has made. We outlined a proposal for it in this document we produced in September 2011 in the trade union movement. We envisaged that money, and we argued in this document, if anyone is prepared to look at it, how other sources of investment could be tapped for commercial investment, because it has to be done that way, otherwise it adds up as public expenditure. We made a big mistake in that document. Big mistake. In September 2011. We urged the government to do what we said in that document. We should have urged them not to do it. That's the way everything coming from the trade union movement is treated in this country. Now, it says 1 minute left. All right. So, 1 minute. Right. So now, the point is, incidentally, that it's not just about budgetary arithmetic. Jobs on the ground, and for every €1 billion invested in infrastructure, it's generally accepted we can get up to close on 10,000 jobs. Jobs on the ground are more important than the budgetary arithmetic, although for the purposes of this discussion here today, I'm talking about them in that context. They are the real key to growth, because when people see those jobs, that's what builds confidence. People can touch them. That's what builds confidence. So that 6 billion, as fast as it can be leveraged in, it's very difficult. I hope it receives attention at the very highest level every day, because if it doesn't, it won't get into the economy by a process of osmosis. But you can actually factor something in for savings on social transfers and revenue buoyancy on the basis of how rapidly you get that, you lever that money into the economy, and you create the jobs and raise the tax and so on. Interestingly, a lot of people don't know, we've actually over the last few years experienced the biggest fall in investment in the country's recorded history. And then there is the last bit, the difficult bit, because you can put in a bit for the infrastructure stimulus and the rest. You're still short of the billion you need to make up. It comes to the hard bit. Because this is where you come to how can you raise money from the people in the top decile? Because that least impacts on the domestic economy. Because they tend to be savers. I'm not looking, Fiona, for the whole 234 billion. Only about 1/3% of it. But it's very interesting, you see, when you come to this. Because as long as the debate is an anodyne debate about it should be 3 billion, 3.1 billion, the government should stick with it, they should show they have the guts and all this, that and the other. If the government took a decision today that they were going to do the 3.1 billion, but they were going to do it by taxing the rich, Be no more calls for 3.1 billion. 5.1% will be back on the table. Just like that. Now, because you see, when it's only about robbing the poor, it's all right. And there's a fundamental dishonesty about the way this debate is being conducted. Because the people who are saying we should do the 3.1 billion should also say, and here's where you'll take it. So that's a democratic decision. In other words, you take the pain for that. Make sure but don't take it from us. That's the way that goes. Now, because despite all the hype about the 52% rate and the 55% rate, the actual effective rate at which people in the top decile contribute is 25.6%. And by raising that by 2.3 percentage points, you can raise €600 million from people who may not be that well able to afford to give it, but they're better able to afford to give it than people who have nothing. That's the reality of it. And in this regard, I want to call here on the Fine Gael party and the government to lift its veto on a contribution from the better off, to display some compassion, and to allow us to rebuild our economy without crucifying the poor. And there might be a way of doing it that would be more acceptable to people in that income decile. If we could create a solidarity contribution that would be designated specifically for expenditure on one thing, like, for example, resources for people with disabilities. A lot of people would be prepared to do that. They resent the money going into the black hole, but they would be prepared to do something like that. And then, if we can steer the economy with a budget like that, you can start to rebuild domestic demand, get the economy back on a growth trajectory, albeit a modest one. Then the question that Fiona has been addressing about credit lines arises. I don't believe our banks will step up to that. While admittedly they are increasing to a great degree in public ownership, the ethos is not a public service ethos. The ethos is get back to business as usual. And that's back to business as it was pre-collapse. Which is why the government should, yes, I'll finish, David, which is why the government should implement its commitments to establish the Strategic Investment Bank. We won't rebuild our economy without one. Then after that, our ministers shouldn't be going along saying this thing is working at European level. Somebody somewhere has to start saying that the emperor has no clothes. Because if we don't wake up soon, in Europe, we'll be in a place we won't be able to get back from. And then after that, there's the question of building our economy, the industrial and economic policy for the medium to longer term. And after landing ourselves in the third major existential crisis in 60 years, we should be able to come up with something better than leave it to the market. Thank you very much, Jim.